I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guest today is Slodov. He is the CEO of Atomic Industries, a techno-industrialist startup based in LA that is building out America's capabilities in its domestic industrial base. Aaron is also the author of a really, really great piece of writing called the Techno-industrial Manifesto that was featured in the Pirate Wires publication a few months back. You can find a link to that, of course, in the episode's show notes. Aaron is combining both his work at Atomic with his writing to help ringlead something called Reindustrialize, which is a big convening of domestic manufacturers, technologists, funders, and policymakers in Detroit the week of June 25th. So in this conversation, we cover Atomic, the case for techno-industrialism, and of course, the convenings and coordination we need to do moving forward for the United States to win in this category.
I would prefer that our adversaries, didn't necessarily fear that we have like all these nuclear weapons and F-35s and aircraft carriers, but an industrial base that could outproduce anybody on the planet. That's a little bit scarier to me personally.
Huge thanks to the Hudson Institute for supporting the work of the Arsenal of Democracy. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Aaron Slodov, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. So let's just start by defining terms. What is techno-industrialism?
I don't want to make up the definition for it, but it would probably involve heavy utilization of, advanced technology to make a step change in some kind of industrial process. So if you're involved in doing that somewhere, I think you'd probably qualify as a techno-industrialist.
I especially appreciated your writing on the Techno-industrialist Manifesto was just your point around how you started or spent a lot of time in your career working at a FANG company. So these are like the big tech companies. You did an AI SaaS startup, and now you're specifically in this techno-industrialist space. And you kind of put forth the idea that there are going to be a lot of founders who go through your journey in this space, much in the same way that Elon started in SaaS, and now is obviously in Tesla and SpaceX. There are going to be more folks such as yourself. So what have you really learned, I think, journeying across all three of the big categories within this industry and now building in this very concrete real world one?
I mean, this does go back to the moving the physical world as fast as the digital world. A higher level abstraction there is being able to move more talent and resources into the physical world and how that ultimately gets built out. So I think like as a movement, I don't think it's necessary for people to go through all those stages and then start a tech-enabled manufacturing company. It'd be cool if people would just start with that now, but it's very hard for investors to underwrite those companies and the founders trying to build those things. So part of this is like, hopefully we can speed up the mega cycle that like ultimately will push more people, resources, and talent into starting these companies. And that's something that I learned, right? Is like a lot of us are going to have to suffer and go through this cycle just to prove our way there, which is unfortunate. And some people would argue that's necessary because it's the only way you can really earn the signaling that you're ready to actually take that on and people will back you. But I don't think it has to be that way at all. It's just I would say that's kind of like one of my most important learnings about this is that we can accelerate that. And beyond that, what the other earlier stages just teach you is um, there are truer and more genuine, things of value in the world beyond SaaS. Um, it's great for people who want to make money and produce some like short-term value, but long-term high value is anything related to like production in my mind. Something that I think about a lot is just that, a lot of people love fantasizing about a sci-fi future, but you don't get to Mars with SaaS necessarily, right? Like, even if you build a successful SaaS company, you still have to build a rocket company and ultimately get to Mars. So, no sci-fi future without a sci-fi industrial base.
So one, I'd like you to just talk about Atomic Industries for a second. Like, you're the CEO there. Love for you to just give us kind of a layout of like the company and what you're working on broadly there.
We're taking, a very low level manufacturing process that's used to produce physical goods, tool and die making, and we are trying to reimagine it using modern technology. So the whole end-to-end stack, from designing and simulating tools and dies to actually like fabricating them, and how do you orchestrate a more efficient process? How do you automate the factory floor? So on and so forth. But you're taking kind of like an aging, evaporating trade and turning it into this kind of like cybernetic version of itself, that's set up for the future. So a lot of this stuff has to be scalable and, more related to advanced kind of like computational techniques and engineering than it is more like trade skill. We don't want to eliminate the need for trade skill, but at the same time, we want to be kind of like a force multiplier on existing tradespeople and new tradespeople. So it takes, decades to become incredibly efficient at tool making as it stands right now. So hopefully we can pare that down and not spare, any of the really mystical depth of knowledge that people build up over time. Still preserve all of that and be able to replicate it through technology.
So that takes us to Reindustrialize, which is a really exciting event you're putting together in Detroit. So you're from the Midwest. You're based in California for Atomic. Kind of give us the origin story of Reindustrialize and what you're trying to do with other folks there.
I mean, it's really the product of many conversations over the past couple of years, talking about, the emerging tailwinds that are surrounding a lot of this field, I think, as we see more and more macro pressure, looking for, deglobalization, reshoring, nearshoring, rapidly modernizing the industrial base. I've had conversations with stakeholders from every possible angle you can imagine. And there's just there's a severe lack of coordination and sophistication around this, obviously, because it's brand new. But it's something that I think we can coordinate better on. And I want to just kind of convene the best possible stakeholders I can in the same room for a couple of days and see what happens.
When you say coordination, what does that mean?
That's a hour-long conversation by itself, but in general, it just means, right? There's somebody right now trying to figure out how to 10x defense production. They have no idea what we do. They have no idea that there are tech companies that are being funded by venture capitalists that are trying to vastly improve industrial processes that could help them make what they need, in a more timely way, especially in response to like a conflict. So there's also capital allocators everywhere looking for places to park money especially now that the market downturn really ripped the bottom out of a lot of high growth tech companies where there truly wasn't a significant amount of value being created or captured. So that's where you see a lot of people turning back to more capital intensive, value productive applications like manufacturing. Um, so I think getting people around the same table, showing them kind of what's happening in this world, and creating just more sophistication around those things and helping make organic connections between people that should probably know each other is part of that coordinating effort.
And given the broader scope of the work you're doing at Atomic and then the Reindustrialize conference, what are the stakes for this debate around how we advance techno-industrialism?
I would say they're quite high. I guess there are probably two things here. One is the modern global economy. We can obviously dive into that, but and beyond that is probably this is hopefully not going to sound too crazy, but maybe world peace. Peace through strength. I don't know. Pax Americana. There might be some aspect of that in terms of the stakes involved.
Something I'm curious about is a lot of folks have seen that there's been a huge rush to invest in the defense sector over the past 2 years. That's due to sort of a cultural shift that you write a bit about, but it's also due to just this very clear consensus post-COVID, post-Ukraine, that it's not 2018 anymore, and there are just clear needs for the U.S. to have a defense capability, and technology is seen as this real hinge point for that. Has all of that defense tech investment energy also spilled over into the manufacturing space, or are they really seen as two separate categories?
No, I think they're separate categories. The manufacturing category itself, in my mind at least, is better encapsulated by the actual advancement and improvement of some underlying industrial process in terms of making it better, cheaper, faster, and scalable. Whereas defense is mostly just application driven. So like, I want a drone, I want a submarine, I want whatever. They don't really care how it gets made. They just want it made. So yeah, I would distinctly make them separate categories for sure.
So I guess that's useful intellectually. I guess what I'm really getting at is, from an investor and capital perspective, has the amount of capital that's gone into the defense sector also been matched by similar levels of interest and focus in on the manufacturing side of things?
Not yet. I don't think so. Definitely not. I think what you'll see is probably a lot of people will rush into the defense space and then realize how capital intensive it is, and more of the weaknesses of the supply chain will become prevalent. I mean, if you have 1,000 companies rush into defense trying to build something that obviously is going to put a strain on the supply base, right? Especially if you're relegated to only using American suppliers. And I know a lot of startup companies will try to get away with, using suppliers in China and elsewhere. Even Mexico is fine, but like, they're going to try wherever they can. And that pressure on the supply base is going to make manufacturing itself for everybody more challenging. And it doesn't matter how much money you have or who you are, suppliers are just going to do work as they receive it. And there's no way to like skip a queue or whatever. Right. So you'll see some of these companies attempt to do more vertical integration and like manufacture their own things, probably just as a constraint of the supply base at large. And that might shift more investment dollars into manufacturing itself. to make it more efficient, capitally speaking. So I think a lot of that pressure you'll see from more movement into the space, like at large.
Something I particularly enjoyed was your piece in Pirate Wires called the Techno-industrial Manifesto. And in it, you've usefully defined conditions for victory, let's put it that way. So two references. The first one you already referenced earlier in this conversation. We need to make manufacturing better, cheaper, and faster through technology. But the end goal here is it should be as easy to make physical things as it is to make software. So before we get into how we actually get to that ease of creation perspective, how easy is it to make software, right? For the non-like tech part of the audience here, when we're defining atoms are as easy as the digital world, what does that mean on the digital world side of things?
I mean, at this point, you can, sign up for a ChatGPT subscription and have it write most of a full application, or at least have, walked you through how to set one up and write all the code for it and deploy it. And you can have an application up and running in, 30 minutes. So I would say that's relatively compressed or condensed in terms of process for pushing something into the world. And a lot of that is not just from like the coding side, but also the infrastructure side too, right? So you've got all these cloud platforms where you can deploy an application and you're hitting like global DNS in 2 seconds, basically. So you can push an app out into the world very quickly using that stack, especially if you know what you're doing. But I would say that's kind of how I think about it.
Something I'm interested then is later on in the piece, you are making an argument about the need for America to be dynamic and hitting that 4% economic growth rate we're all focusing on when it comes to GDP. You specifically argue that manufacturing is the way to get there, and that important but maybe less relevant categories include investment, banking, software as service, SaaS companies, and AI. So in that story that you just told about how ChatGPT has made it so that you could spit out a program in 30 minutes, that would suggest that part of what makes software so cheap and such a specific opportunity in the future is the fact that you can use AI tools to make those sort of cost advancements. So I'd be curious, when you're thinking of the manufacturing opportunity and the role it plays in America's growth and productivity, should we separate AI from manufacturing, or are these all categories that basically kind of mix together in different ways?
I think it's going to be challenging to lump them together. One of them will have a raw output in terms of manufacturing capacity and production of durable and non-durable goods. So in terms of what percentage AI plays in increasing that throughput, that's anybody's guess. I think it'll probably be more a function of how I kind of laid out like the different layers of at least how I see the industrial base as like a holistic picture. So yeah, I mean, if you can basically measure the output of durable and non-durable goods, and somehow figure out what percentage of that is due to AI, like I guess you could slice it that way. But until we have like cookie cutter AI powered factories all over the U.S., it's going to be really hard to say what that makeup looks like.
When you describe the cookie cutter AI powered factory, I kind of think from a policy perspective, that would seem to be the goal we're really aiming for here. To what degree is that vision of the future at all attainable within a relevant timeline, given the broader geopolitical and deterrent stakes we talked about earlier in the episode? How close are we to an environment like that? Or is that just not a helpful vision for thinking about what our end goal is?
It's not that it's not helpful. It's just contextually, you either do it in wartime or you do it in peacetime. So wartime is a completely different environment. That's a forcing function for whatever you want. Outside of that, you need market forces to drive any of those things, right? So I don't think they go hand in hand at all. Because if we go to wartime, then the Defense Production Act will kick in, and nobody's going to care about developing AI for manufacturing. You're just going to convert every factory you can into wartime production to cover all of that. And this is, I don't know if I really outlined it too succinctly, but yeah, there are these two very distinct buckets when you think about this context, where one is I need manufacturing capacity right now, and that costs a lot of money because factories cost a lot of money. And then the other bucket is basically I want to fundamentally improve factories and manufacturing to make them better, cheaper, faster. So if you can have the cost of a factory using technology, that's awesome, especially if you can scale it over and over again. But that takes a lot of time and investment to rebuild that manufacturing process. So that's why I see them as kind of like totally distinct, separate buckets. And the like, I need a factory now is what we're teetering on, right? Because we're not, I mean, we are and we aren't directly in like a major wartime scenario right now, but until Congress actually declares war on somebody, we're not there yet. And, if you look at the production of artillery or any of these other things, those are all functions of just contracts, basically, not our ability. And there's a lot of story behind that too. But, if somebody incentivizes General Dynamics enough, they'll make 10 more factories and pump out 100 times more artillery, but nobody's doing that. So
you've actually got to the core of something I'm really fascinated by, which is if we're describing the opportunity and the need when it comes to increasing our manufacturing capability, the question is this a matter of policy? Is this a matter of like we're waiting for this new widget or this new technological development that will actually make it possible for us to manufacture in the ways that we're sort of describing for? And then there's the third one, which is just basically broader incentives and labor force and those different issues. As you're thinking about this and you put together like a really impressive event tied into these questions called Reindustrialize, if you're thinking of like, to what degree is this a policy versus the technology versus a markets question, how would you kind of divide up those three different buckets in terms of how central they are to solving this issue?
I think no matter what I say, it's probably going to sound naive in some way, but I think that industrial policy is the number one priority. All incentives and outcomes can be shaped by policy. It doesn't, I mean, right? Like we have the ability right now to build fusion reactors. I mean, Europe is doing it. It's taken them 20 years to actually build it. But, you could argue we could be building, Nixon wanted to build 1,000 nuclear power plants. We have the ability to do that, but we regulate it all away. And that's a technological solution that would solve all of our energy problems like tomorrow. And that is fascinating, right? Like, why do we hamstring ourselves? Is that a matter of, are we just too cautious about the ability of these technologies to harm ourselves and our environment? Are we being too cautious about how we strive forward into the future? I personally don't think that humanity makes progress without wild risk taking. Like even as we get smarter and more advanced, there's no difference between the last inch and the last mile of turning on a new technology, whether it's AI, 1,000 nuclear power plants, or 10,000 AI powered factories. Like there's no difference. You either do it or you don't do it. And there is risk. There's always going to be risk involved in that. It's just a matter of how fast we want to go. So, yeah, I do think it's mostly policy that will control a lot of this. And I think that all of those types of policies are intertwined, like you can't scale manufacturing without energy. And you can't scale AI without energy. I mean, like they're all fascinating and intertwined. But yeah, ultimately, I think industrial policy has set a not great track record for itself historically. And that's kind of why we find ourselves in a time when deglobalization is so, forward in the global like zeitgeist. Basically, what all the economists said would happen is the complete opposite. So instead of intertwining all our economies and making us happy and averse to conflict, it's proving to just do the complete opposite. So it's nobody knew that was going to happen, but it has completely backfired.
I'm really fascinated by the industrial policy conversation. And I hope you all get into this at Reindustrialize, because if we were just to broadly say, let's say it's the year 1995, America wants to reverse globalization and we're going to pursue this big government policy that's going to bring manufacturing back. I would say that when you're talking that broadly, I'd say the track record of that sort of policy is going to be weaker. But when we're talking specifically about manufacturing, especially in defense-related industries, where to your point, this is literally about contracts. If we just said, hey, we're going to appropriate money and buy X number of rounds in the year 2028, I think that would be successful. And that would also, in a weird way, constitute industrial policy. So I just find that when we try to have the industrial policy conversation in the abstract, and instead of just focusing specifically on the specific industry or the specific function or the specific task we're looking to get, it sort of obscures it. But I'm curious how you kind of think about like that, like awkward, what's the intersection between those?
I think that thinking is backwards, right? Most thinking around this stuff is way too short-term oriented. I think a lot of it is geared to be long-term, but what ends up happening is like short-term interests ultimately ruin a lot of the long-term kind of goodwill and planning and hope that goes into changing something at a larger, longer scale. Because ultimately the people in power are just reflecting through that lens, right? And their interests are all generally like short-term. And I know that's a massive generalization, but I think that a lot of the thinking is backwards, and it goes back to the thinking about the application layer primarily, right? Like we need planes and drones and submarines and blah, 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 and artillery. They all kind of think that whatever needs to support all of that effort to happen just happens as like downstream effects. But why not think about the reverse of that? And this is something else that I kind of wrote about, which is I would prefer that our adversaries, didn't necessarily fear that we have like all these nuclear weapons and F-35s and aircraft carriers, but an industrial base that could outproduce anybody on the planet. That's a little bit scarier to me personally. And, Russia has an interesting example of how they can flip their industrial base back and forth between peacetime and wartime. And that's what we have the Defense Production Act for, but otherwise market forces are driving a lot of other spending in the industrial base. And defense is only like not tiny, but it's a smaller portion of the overall industrial base, comparatively to space and energy and just at like the industry at large for commercial related uses.
Yeah, something I'm interested in then is obviously this is the Arsenal of Democracy podcast, so I'm skewed towards the defense side of things, but how big is the like sector of opportunity when we're talking about the industrial base? So energy, other forms of manufacturing, like how should we conceive of that?
I mean, in terms of like total GDP, manufacturing is roughly like 11 or 12 trillion. So it's quite large, but it's honestly like really hard to break that down because that includes any industrial process basically, and it's challenging to say like what within that maps over to defense. Are you counting basically like a warehouse where people are assembling some parts for a drone, or a place where all the parts are individually made, the people making the raw materials that go into it, like all of that gets lumped into one nice figure, and it's challenging. I mean, like, I think NIST makes one of the most comprehensive annual or semi-annual reports on the industrial base. So I highly recommend checking that out. It has really great breakdowns, in a lot of different areas and sectors by globally ranking us and by internally ranking us like year over year, how we perform in different areas. So
last question here then is, to your point, we can't afford from a stakes perspective a situation that requires someone to park themselves at a FANG company for a couple of years, go through a couple of startups, maybe get an exit, and then switch into the industrialism space. Ideally, you could cut out those first two categories. But I'd be curious, though, from a capital allocation, from an investment perspective, from a government investment perspective, what do you sort of see then as the useful signalers that folks are focusing on, if not those first two? So if not, okay, they like went to Stanford and got an MBA and then worked at a FANG, and then not, okay, they've had a couple of startups in the digital space. Like, what are some useful initial rubrics or frameworks we could kind of look at?
I think a lot of people are reinventing how the trade system kind of works. If you become a journeyman, you have to get so many hours or years of experience, before you kind of progress. That's happening again in a really subtle way that I don't think a lot of people understand, which is like these companies like SpaceX and Tesla that they absorb a lot of really high quality engineers and then spit them out after a few years, right? And like, you've got the SpaceX mafia and blah, blah, blah. That's kind of what's happening there. So you have this initial layer of companies that are producing, they're basically like journeyman tradespeople, basically. They've been exposed enough where the really high agency ones that are good will be able to gather resources and start a company. That's kind of how I see it.
So the key takeaway then would be, now that we have, ideally, knock on wood, a critical mass of these hard, deep defense tech related companies, there should actually be a real layer of engineering, technical, business talent, et cetera, that could be leveraged into these other categories as well too, because that is what didn't exist in 2009 or 2014, those earlier, like really SaaS driven mobile computing eras. So that's very, very helpful to think about. Aaron, this has been super helpful. Best of luck with Reindustrialize and the broader coordination efforts that are going to be coming out of that, because once again, this is not going to be solved over a mid-weekend or early week convening.
100%. Yeah. Get ready for the marathon.
Thanks for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks, Marshall. All right, take care.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.